Meanwhile, in India, only those who strongly believe in rebirth should risk going near. Meanwhile, in Texas. Meanwhile, in Japan. Meanwhile, in Canada, whoever stole my GPS last night, you might as well have the rest of the cables and instructions. Meanwhile, in Japan, please urinate with precision and elegance. Meanwhile, in Minnesota. Meanwhile, in London, Level 5 goose warning. The goose on platform 2 is violent and has claimed the platform as his own. Please avoid. Meanwhile, in France. Meanwhile, in Australia, we couldn't access the meter. Massive spider attached to box. Has red fangs. Meanwhile, in Poland. Meanwhile, in Japan, Japan doesn't sugarcoat their clothing sizes. Fat. Meanwhile, in Sweden. Meanwhile, in USA, while dogs nationwide are hiding under beds. Meanwhile, in Japan. Meanwhile, in Florida. Meanwhile, in Texas. Meanwhile, in Springfield, Ohio, honk if shit is falling off. Meanwhile, in Bosnia. Meanwhile, in Montreal. Meanwhile, in China, 50-lane highway merges into 4. Meanwhile, in Texas. Meanwhile, in Iceland, this is not the Penis Museum. Go back to Legovigo, the street, turn left, direction downtown, and walk 20 meters, 60 feet. It will be on the same side. You can't miss it. It has a big penis logo. Sincerely, the people who work here. Meanwhile, in Alaska. Meanwhile, in Australia, high is the second lowest fire danger rating. Meanwhile, in Korea. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Egypt. Meanwhile, in Japan.
Deja vu, I've just been in this place before. Higher.
Meanwhile, in Venice. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, in Russia. Seems legit. Meanwhile, in Kearney, Nebraska. Meanwhile, in Florida. My sister lives in Florida and sends some weird pictures of people. This was most recent. Meanwhile, in Finland, we really do love our personal space. Meanwhile, in Houston. Meanwhile, in Ohio. Meanwhile, in Sweden. Meanwhile, in Zagreb, Croatia. Meanwhile, in Germany. Meanwhile, in Canada, darn the police. Meanwhile, in Texas. Meanwhile, in Texas, this is apparently an acceptable food aisle in Texas. Meanwhile, park benches in Finland. I see these winter posts and all I can think is, meanwhile in Australia, meanwhile in Canada, meanwhile in Australia, high risk area, next 15 kilometers, meanwhile in Canada, meanwhile in Venice, Italy, meanwhile in my hometown in Romania. Meanwhile, in Singapore, get out of the sun if your skin tone matches this sign. This isn't Jersey Shore. Meanwhile in Japan. Meanwhile in Nebraska. Meanwhile in Szczecin, Poland. Meanwhile in Dubai. Meanwhile in India. Meanwhile in Florida, no refunds on gator meat. Yes, it is chewy. Yes, it is fishy. Yes, it is gamey. It is meat from an alligator, not chicken. Meanwhile in Florida. Meanwhile in Texas. Meanwhile in a Birmingham, Alabama bar bathroom. This shelf is meant for drinks and snorting cocaine. Please do not f*** your girlfriend on it. Meanwhile in Canada, this street, the other street, that street. Meanwhile in China, at least I don't do crystal meth in the bathroom all night. Meanwhile in Japan. Meanwhile in Florida. Meanwhile in Finland, warnings of icy roads, forest fires, grass fires and high winds. Meanwhile in Germany they have how you know you're about to board a flight in Florida. Meanwhile in rural Bavaria, Germany. Meanwhile in Hong Kong, Gov, mother of f***s. Meanwhile in Australia, the situation grows dire. Running low on chicken nuggets, requesting airdrop. Meanwhile in China. Meanwhile in Finland. Meanwhile in Florida, my co-worker's friend just saw this in Florida while driving. They were even barking. Meanwhile in Dubai, gold to go, the gold ATM. Meanwhile in New Orleans. Meanwhile the artwork at a childcare center in Argentina. Hola chicos. Meanwhile in Canada, aftermath of legalization at a grocery store. Meanwhile in Arizona. Meanwhile in Colorado, our chickens don't do drugs or GMOs. Our chickens do drugs. Meanwhile in India, a Domino pizza, Pizza Hot. Meanwhile in the Bahamas. Meanwhile in France.